This is Whiskey Whereabouts, I'm Tim, and this is a first edition of the Whiskies of Scotland, a book from 1967 in this slim volume. We've got a pretty in-depth overview of the world of Scotch whiskey at that time, and there were a lot of differences, one very big difference in particular, but reading through this book, I was struck by two things. One, the more things change, the more they stay the same. And two, this book is basically Whiskey YouTube circa 1967. My whiskey journey has taken me to Scotland and back. I've explored whiskey education, tastings, and distilleries from Islay to Speyside. And now my journey continues here, with you, on Whiskey Whereabouts. So this book is written by R.J.S. McDowell. He is identified as a professor emeritus at the University of London and an MD, and he has a real passion for Scotch whiskey. And he's writing to us from an era with real significance in terms of the sort of arc of Scotch whiskey that leads us to where we are today. It's 1967 when this book is coming out. 1963 is when Glenfiddich is popularizing the export of single malt outside of Scotland. 1969, we're going to have our first visitor center open. The lack of visitor centers does not stop Dr. McDowell, who has traveled all around Scotland visiting distilleries and sampling whiskey from nearly all of them. So what does the world of Scotch whiskey look like in this time period? Let us open up the book and journey back to 1967. So here in 1967, according to the book, we have 100 distilleries in operation as compared to the 151 that we have currently operating here, not all the way through 2024, with obviously lots more to come in different stages of development, right? And of those distilleries, Dr. McDowell only identifies 30 single malts on the market. I've listed them here for you to peruse the list. Look at what's missing. Look how few single malts are identified. He's grouped in his book all islands, which is in keeping with the discussions we've had recently on the channel, identifying one whiskey per region. If you haven't checked out that video, make sure you do. But he's got the Islay, he has Jura, he has Talisker and Highland Park all grouped as island malts. Only 2 single malts from Islay. He's got 2 Lowland malts, 2 Campbeltown malts, and only 5 Highland malts. He refers to them as northern malts. The rest are all Speyside, which he is subdivided into the Glenlivet's and then the Dufftown and nearby malts. So what do we understand, at least from the pages of this volume, about the character of Scotch whiskey here at this moment? Well, the first thing that we can expect is that it was matured in sherry casks. Here in the book, Dr. McDowell is talking about sherry casks traditionally having been used to import sherry, being used to mature the Scotch whiskey, that sherry casks are best, and that the bourbon casks imported from the US are used when the sherry casks are in short supply. He's also talking about the same ABV. He's talking about it in proof, UK proof, not the simple sort of US formula for calculating the proof. And he's talking basically, though, 40% ABV up to a little bit above 50% ABV whiskey. So here in 1967, technology has made the use of peat optional, right? It's no longer necessary as a heat source during the malting process. And in fact, Dr. McDowell points out that a lot of the distilleries here in 1967 are using coke to create heat during the process rather than peat. The peat is still being used, but it's only being used to impart the flavor, same as it is today. And he points out that a lot of the distilleries here in 1967 are already sourcing their malts, same as it is in the present day. But you get the impression from his description of a lot of the whiskeys that still feature sort of peated character that you and I wouldn't expect to do so. And his commitment to this idea that he comes out and says that he doesn't think you can have a great Scotch whiskey if it isn't peated. The impression you get is that we're in this sort of transitional period where the peat may be obsolete, but it's still being used because it had been used traditionally by a lot more distilleries than use it today. And so we've got a lot of whiskeys that are going to have a peated element in their profile that we wouldn't expect. And when he points out some of the sort of best examples of great peated whiskeys, he lists Laphroaig, Glenfiddich, and Campbeltown. Dr. McDowell feels that at least a Highland whiskey should be bottled before it's aged more than 15 years, that after the fact it gets too woody. He also talks about whiskey they had from 35 years previously. It seems they're in open bottles, but he's still talking about how it's better than the whiskey he's able to get today. Does any of this sound familiar? Okay, how's this? Dr. McDowell also shares his understanding of how the practice of adding artificial color to Scotch whiskey began. He says that 40 years ago, 40 years before his time, the whiskey was appreciably darker. He says that at some point in the intervening years, the government had mandated that whiskey could not be sold at greater than 70 proof. They were trying to conserve barley, and as a result, the resulting whiskey was paler, and so he understands that patrons complained in London clubs and thinking that the whiskey had been diluted, and so artificial coloring was added so the whiskey would look the same. And this practice continues, he notes, even though in his day whiskey was once again able to be sold at a higher proof, higher than the 70 proof. He is concerned about the practice of adding this artificial coloring to tired sherry casks, and he's also concerned about the flavor of the color. Specifically, he says that some companies appear to have been experimenting with coloring matter which is less sweet, and sometimes it falls to the bottom of the bottle. He says the clearer fluid, not where the coloring has settled at the bottom, tastes quite normal. Age statements. Dr. McDowell says that there's some too young whiskey being sold out on the market, barely over 3 years. He's against this. He thinks that all of the single malt whiskey should be aged 10 years, and it should say so on the label. He commends Glenlivet for always identifying the age statements of the various releases, and he thinks all the other distilleries should do this as well. We've been talking about regions on the channel a lot lately. Let's go dig in and take a tour around the regions. At times he only identifies 4, sometimes he subdivides Speyside into 2 of its own regions, but let's start in Speyside and take a quick tour around to get a feel for what the whiskeys that we might be familiar with were like back in the day. So Dr. McDowell refers to Strathspey as the sort of center of the Scotch whiskey industry and identifies Elgin as basically the capital, where there are key distilleries located, and Gordon MacPhail's bottling is located there, which he feels is a very reliable bottler. He is hung up a little bit on the differences between barleys. He thinks that the Highland barley is providing a little bit of a fruitier quality, which he's probably wrong about, and it's probably the result of some other decisions that are being made in terms of the fermentation, the maturation at these distilleries, but he also feels that it needs to age longer than the Lowland whiskey. He goes through the history of the sort of Glenlivet and the Glenlivet suffix. If you don't know, there was a time when basically Glenlivet was an identifier, regional identifier. We might use Speyside in place for now, and distilleries used to have that as a suffix at the end. They'd have their distillery name, Glenlivet, as if of Glenlivet. He points out that Macallan, their whiskey is so good that they don't need to utilize the Glenlivet distinction. And as we sit here today, Macallan doesn't even use the Speyside distinction, right? The Macallan bottle says it's Highland whiskey. So Macallan, he says, many consider to be the best of the Speyside whiskeys. They had to double their production capabilities just before this book came out in 1965, and they don't, at this time, market a whiskey younger than that 10-year threshold. Cardew has recently put some whiskey out about 1965 single malt whiskey. He's not impressed. So Glenfarclas, he understands to mostly go into blends, but he does point out that they have one bottling with an odd ABV, a 105 proof. He tells us that Linkwood is not very well known, but it's similar to Lowland whiskey. He says, Tomatin, the flavor is too obscured by the peat, and he says Blair Athol should be better known, and that remains true to this day. From the More Things Stay the Same file, Dr. McDowell tells us that in 1955, Glenfiddich had to basically rebuild the whole distillery to step up production, and along with expansion at neighboring Balvenie, they're one of the biggest Highland distilleries. They're selling whiskey in triangular bottles at 70 proof, and he notes that they're one of the driest whiskeys, but listen to this, he identifies Mortlach as being the fruitiest in that Dufftown area. Over in the Highlands, Dr. McDowell points out that most of these distilleries are not that well known because most of their whiskey goes into blends, but he is intrigued by Old Pulteney because it's not peated, and it suggests to him that maybe it's possible to have good whiskey without the peat. He's very impressed with Clynelish. He says it's as full flavored whiskey as you're going to find in Scotland. He compares it to Islay whiskey. Dalmorey describes as dry, slightly peated. Glenmorangie is as light as a Lowland. Sounds pretty familiar. He says it doesn't need much time in the warehouse as a result. And Balblair is very full flavored. Down in the Lowlands, there are only 2 distilleries that are offering single malt. Rosebank is light, similar to Glenmorangie, but there's no mature Bladnoch yet because the distillery just reopened in 1956. Down in Campbeltown, he counts 32 distilleries having been closed, and he attributes this to the distilleries making bad whiskey in bad casks, rushed out to meet demand, and ruining the reputation of Campbeltown as a region, right? Imagine that. So there's 2 left, and of course, he says that Springbank was the one that was good enough to survive this crash. He is talking about the floor maltings. He's talking about 2 spirit stills with the 3rd wash still. He thinks it's going to make a lighter whiskey. A lot of similar talk that we have, right? And what's also similar is that Glen Scotia here in 1967 is still the other Campbeltown distillery. He thinks it's richer, more oily than the Springbank. Let's make a trip over to Islay to see just how much things have changed since 1967. I'm going to read this straight from the description of Laphroaig, which he describes as having a more than an aggressive, peaty flavor. Most people say they taste medicinal, something like antiseptic, so much so that they are harsh and to some people pungent and unpleasant. He also correctly points out that Laphroaig is located on one of the most beautiful shores of Islay. He says it's a lovely distillery with flower boxes, which he attributes to the fact that it is at that time being run by a woman. It's 1967 still. But he is also keen to let us know about a couple obscure Islay distilleries, all of whose whiskey goes into blends. One of these is a distillery called Lagavulin. It's owned by Diageo's predecessor, and the whiskey's going into the White Horse blend. There's another distillery called Bruichladdich, and he describes this whiskey as rich and pleasant, but without the medicine of Laphroaig. Over on the islands here in 1967, things are so different. Talisker is owned by a company called DLC, the predecessor to Diageo, and it's not as mellow as it used to be in Dr. McDowell's opinion, and he does believe that there is color added to darken it. The other whiskey he highlights is Highland Park, which he doesn't care for, watered down 40%, but does enjoy at a higher ABV. So in his circa 1967 version of Whisky YouTube, does Dr. McDowell have any opinions about how we should be enjoying all the whiskey he's described? He sure does. He doesn't seem to think that it should ever be mixed with anything but water. He is very much against adding ice, any fruit juice, especially ginger ale, and he says that Americans are the absolute worst about this. They want everything to be cold. So Dr. McDowell is talking to us from a boom time for Scotch whiskey. He doesn't know what's coming in the 80s and beyond, but he has some concerns, and one of these is the high rate of taxation on Scotch whiskey, and he says coupled with the high cost of aging, maturing the whiskey, this creates what he describes as a temptation for blenders to produce whiskey that is too young and is going to sort of bring down the reputation. Remember how he describes what happened to Campbeltown, and he says that it's very easy to see other places in the world outside of Scotland being able to produce whiskey that is good enough, certainly to go into blends, and that for Scotch whiskey to maintain its position, it needs to maintain its level of quality. And he describes this as a responsibility for the distilleries and for the industry. So as we close the book on 1967, back here in 2024, we can see how the same concerns never go away. If you do any sort of research into the SWA, which existed in 1967, he talks about the SWA and its mission in the book, is addressing so many of these same concerns, right? Especially about taxation rates and competition and all of the like. But what really struck me of taking this journey into the past here is how Dr. McDowell is just another one of us. He's got the passion for the whiskey. He's got the appreciation for all the sort of variety, and so interested in what the different qualities and where they might be coming from. And I could absolutely see him having a fantastic channel we'd all be subscribing to if he's here with us today. And if you've enjoyed taking this journey with me, make sure you subscribe. We're getting very close to that 2,000 subscriber mark. I've got my sort of special Lagavulin sort of face-off tasting waiting in the wings for us to hit that number. So if you haven't subscribed, make sure you do, and I will see you on the next one.